It started as a family camping trip, the kind of outing meant to build memories around a crackling fire under the endless Australian sky. But what I remember most isn't the laughter or the warmth of the fire. It's the moment I saw him, motionless, watching from the hill. We were deep in the Queensland outback, miles from any real civilization, standing in the overgrown remains of a place my father called Spike's hut. He spoke of it often, recounting tales of the violent old farmer who once lived there. Spike, a man whose temper was as infamous as the scars that riddled his face. According to local whispers, he'd disappeared decades ago after a drunken brawl gone wrong, but some folks swore they still saw a shadow moving in the ruins of his home. Dad, an experienced outdoorsman, loved places like this, isolated, untouched, filled with history. He never worried about old ghost stories or strange happenings. But I did. That afternoon, as the sun bled across the horizon, I saw the cowboy on the hill. He wasn't like the scarecrows you sometimes saw in forgotten fields. His hat was too perfect, his posture too deliberate. He sat slumped, his shoulders hunched forward as if held up only by some invisible force. Even from a distance, I could tell something was wrong. His head was bent at an unnatural angle, and he never moved, not even when the wind howled across the open land. I nudged my dad and pointed toward the figure. "Who's that?" I asked. Dad followed my gaze, but instead of answering, his face darkened. "Pack up, now." There was no hesitation in his voice, no curiosity, just the sharp command of a man who knew something I didn't. My stomach twisted with unease, but I obeyed, stuffing sleeping bags and gear into our truck while my friends whispered anxiously nearby. I glanced back once more as we drove away. The cowboy hadn't moved, but I swear his head had turned, just a fraction, just enough. We didn't talk much on the way home, and Dad refused to explain what he saw. But I never forgot the way his hands trembled against the wheel. Years passed before I returned to Spike's hut, this time with a group of friends. We were young, reckless, and fueled by the confidence that only comes with time and distance. I told them the story of the cowboy on the hill, laughing it off as a trick of the light. They dared me to prove it, and I accepted. The hut was more decayed than before, its walls barely standing, the roof swallowed by creeping vines. The air was thick with the scent of rot, as if the land itself had been left to fester. Then we found the signs: a makeshift grill still coated in grease, footsteps in the mud, and worst of all, a tiny dirt-streaked piece of fabric, the kind a child might wear. The laughter died in our throats. Something had been here, something still was, and as the wind picked up, carrying the distant echo of what could have been laughter or just the rustling trees, I turned toward the hill. The cowboy was gone, but the unease in my gut told me he had never truly left. Working as a park ranger always came with its fair share of odd encounters. You get used to dealing with lost hikers, aggressive wildlife, and the occasional thrill-seeker who thinks they're invincible. But nothing prepared me for Sam. Sam was hired as a seasonal ranger the same year I transferred to the national park's headquarters. At first, he seemed like any other new recruit. Quiet, a little awkward, maybe even socially clumsy. But there was something else about him, something that felt off. He had a way of staring too long, of lingering just a little too close, of laughing at things that weren't funny. I tried to ignore it. After all, we worked in a remote area, living on site in ranger housing with only a handful of other staff. It wasn't unusual for people to be a little strange when they spent too much time in the wilderness. Then the messages started. At first, they were harmless, short texts about work schedules, questions about trail closures. But then they turned personal. "Saw you hiking alone today. You shouldn't be out there by yourself." I hadn't told anyone I was hiking. "I think we have a lot in common. You'll see that soon." I started to feel uneasy, but I convinced myself I was overreacting. He was just trying to be friendly, right? Maybe he didn't understand boundaries. Then came the night I woke up to the sound of knocking on my cabin door. It was past midnight, and the entire site was silent. The other rangers were asleep in their own cabins, scattered around the station. My stomach tightened as I crept to the door, peering through the curtain. It was Sam. He stood in the dim glow of the porch light, staring at the door, his hands shoved deep in his pockets. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. "I know you're awake," he called softly. "I just want to talk." I stayed silent, hoping he'd leave. He didn't. He lingered there for what felt like an eternity before finally turning and walking off into the dark. The next day, I reported it to my supervisor. He shrugged it off. "Sam's just a little socially awkward. He probably didn't mean anything by it." Fine. Maybe I was imagining things. Maybe I was making too much of nothing. Then the emails started, dozens of them. Paragraphs of text, rambling about fate, about how we were meant to be friends, about how he understood me better than anyone else. Some were sweet, almost pleading. Others were angry. "Why do you ignore me? You think you're better than me? You'll regret this." I blocked his number, stopped checking my email. I avoided him at work, but it was impossible not to run into him. I felt him watching me from across the ranger station, his eyes following me when I passed by. Then one evening, as I was closing up the visitor center, I noticed something on my car. A note. "I see you." That was it. Just 3 words scribbled in jagged, erratic handwriting. Panic surged through me. I wasn't alone. I couldn't be. I turned in a slow circle, scanning the trees, the parking lot, the darkening trailheads leading into the forest. Nothing. Just the whisper of wind through the trees, the distant hoot of an owl. But I knew he was there, watching. I ran back inside and locked the doors, my hands shaking as I dialed my supervisor again. This time he listened. Sam was put on suspension. They told him to pack his things and leave the park. He didn't take it well. When law enforcement arrived to escort him off the property, they found something chilling. Sam's car was packed, full of supplies, as if he had planned to stay in the woods for weeks. And inside, tucked beneath the driver's seat, was a loaded firearm. Next to it was a folded letter, a suicide note, and in it, my name. Sam had written about me extensively, about how I had ruined everything and how he couldn't leave without making sure I understood what I had done to him. The police took him away that night. I never saw him again. He was banned from all national parks, put under some kind of psychiatric supervision, but I never truly felt safe after that. Even after I moved to a different post, hundreds of miles away, I always had the same lingering fear. What if he came back? What if one day I woke up to knocking on my door again? What if, this time, he didn't stop at knocking? Some places are never meant to be inhabited. When I first got assigned to the remote duty station in the Arizona wilderness, I was excited. It was the kind of assignment most rangers either loved or hated. Miles from the nearest town, no cell reception, no internet, just you and the land. It was a post meant for solitude, for those who wanted to escape. At the time, I thought that sounded perfect. The station itself was a simple wooden structure, originally built in the 1930s. It had been renovated over the years, but the isolation remained the same. The nearest ranger station was about 30 miles away, and the only road leading in was a winding dirt path barely wide enough for a single truck. I arrived in early summer, joined by a small fire crew and our supervisor, Carl. He was an old-school ranger, the kind who had spent more time in the wilderness than in civilization. He didn't say much, but when he did, it was usually something worth listening to. "At night, don't go outside alone," he told us during our first briefing. "Not unless you have to." I thought he was talking about the usual dangers, mountain lions, rattlesnakes, maybe even the occasional bear. But I was wrong. The first few weeks passed uneventfully. Our days were spent clearing trails, monitoring fire risks, and making sure the backcountry campers weren't being reckless. The nights, however, were something else entirely. It started with the sounds, distant voices drifting through the trees, faint, murmuring whispers that never seemed to belong to any particular direction. Sometimes it sounded like a woman calling for help. Other times, it was a child laughing. The first time I heard it, I assumed it was just an echo from some campers in the distance. But as the days passed, I noticed something strange. No one else seemed to hear them. One evening, I was in the main cabin, writing in my logbook, when I heard my name. It was soft, barely above a whisper, but it was unmistakable. "Come outside." The silent screams, the channel of interesting horror stories. If you are new on this channel, then don't forget to subscribe The Silent Screams and press the bell icon for interesting stories. Before we move on, please donate me in the form of subscribe. I froze, my pen hovering over the page. The voice had come from just outside the window. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to stay still. My breath felt too loud in the quiet of the cabin. Then I heard it again. Come outside. I turned my head slowly, my pulse hammering against my ribs. The window beside me was dark, the glass reflecting only the dim glow of my lantern. But beyond that, a shadow. Not a person, not an animal, just a shape. Something tall, something wrong. It was right outside the window. I stood up so fast my chair nearly toppled over. I grabbed my flashlight and flicked it on, shining it toward the glass. Nothing, just trees and darkness. I took a shaky breath, telling myself I had imagined it. I had to have imagined it. Then, from outside the door, a knock, slow, deliberate. I turned off the lantern. The knocking came again, 3 steady raps against the wood. I gripped my flashlight tighter, my knuckles white. My mind raced through possibilities. One of the crew members, but why would they be knocking like that? Why not call out? I stepped toward the door, then the doorknob started to turn. I backed away, my breath catching in my throat. The knob twisted left, then right, as if someone was testing the lock. I had locked it. I was sure I had locked it. But now I wasn't so sure. Then, silence. I waited, counting the seconds in my head. 5, 10, 15. Nothing. After what felt like an eternity, I finally found the courage to move toward the window. I peered outside, scanning the trees. The clearing was empty. No movement, no footprints in the dirt. But I wasn't alone. I could feel it. The next morning, I told Carl about what had happened. His face remained unreadable, but he let out a slow breath and nodded. Yeah, it happens sometimes. That was all he said. No explanation, no reassurance. Just that. I didn't sleep much after that, and whatever it was, it didn't stop. Sometimes I'd hear footsteps circling the cabin late at night. Other times, the whispers returned, closer than before. Then, one night, something worse happened. One of my crewmates, Jake, had gone outside to use the bathroom. He was gone for less than 2 minutes when we heard him screaming. I ran to the door, flashlight in hand, just in time to see him sprinting back toward the cabin, his face pale with terror. We barely got the door shut before he collapsed onto the floor, gasping for breath. It was me. His voice was shaking. I saw myself. None of us understood what he meant at first. Then he told us. As he was walking back, he saw someone standing at the edge of the trees. Someone who looked exactly like him. Same uniform, same face, same expression. His doppelganger just stood there, staring at him. And then, without a sound, it smiled. A slow, knowing smile. Jake swore up and down that it wasn't just a trick of the dark. It wasn't a reflection. It wasn't an illusion. It was himself, standing in the trees, watching. He refused to stay another night after that. The next morning, he packed his things and left. I don't blame him. Because after that night, I started hearing something new. Not just voices, not just footsteps, but my own voice. Outside my window whispering my name, and it was laughing. I've worked in some of the most remote parts of the country, but nowhere has ever unsettled me quite like Olympic National Park. It's a stunning place, towering forests, endless mountain ranges, and a thick mist that rolls in like something out of a dream. Or a nightmare. I was stationed near Lake Ozette, a place steeped in history. The Maka people had lived there for thousands of years, and hidden beneath the soil were remnants of long-lost settlements, buried under centuries of earth and time. I didn't think much about that at first. I was there for a restoration project, working on repairing old ranger cabins and maintaining trails. But by the second week, I started to notice something strange. Every night, around dusk, the forest would fall silent. If you've ever spent time in the woods, you know how unnatural that is. The wilderness is never truly quiet. There's always the rustling of leaves, the chirp of insects, the distant hoot of an owl. But here, when the sun dipped below the horizon, the sounds would stop completely. And then, like clockwork, I'd hear it. A piano. Soft, distant, but unmistakable. The sound of someone playing a slow, haunting melody deep in the trees. At first I thought I was imagining it. Maybe a hiker had brought a Bluetooth speaker. Or maybe the wind was carrying music from a nearby campsite. But there were no other campers nearby, and the nearest road was miles away. One evening, after another long day of work, I decided to follow the sound. The music drifted through the trees, just loud enough to keep me moving. The deeper I went, the stronger the feeling of unease became. The trees in this part of the forest were ancient, their trunks wide and gnarled, their roots twisting like fingers beneath the soil. I don't know how far I walked, but eventually I saw it. A piano. Sitting in the middle of a small clearing, its wooden frame warped and weathered, its keys yellowed with age. It was old, far too old to be out here, exposed to the elements. And yet, as I stepped closer, I could still hear the music. But the keys weren't moving. The air around me felt thick, heavy. My skin prickled with the undeniable sensation of being watched. Then the music stopped. The silence that followed was worse than any sound. I turned, suddenly desperate to get away, but as I did, I caught a glimpse of something in my peripheral vision. A figure standing at the edge of the trees. Tall, motionless, barely visible in the fading light. I didn't stay to get a better look. I ran. By the time I made it back to my cabin, I could still hear the last echoes of the piano ringing in my ears. That night, I locked my door, shut my windows, and sat in bed, trying to convince myself that it had all been in my head, that I had let my imagination get the best of me. Then, at exactly midnight, I woke up. Not to the piano, but to the sound of breathing. Slow, heavy, just outside my window. I didn't move. I barely breathed myself. My cabin was in the middle of nowhere. There was no one else around. No reason for anyone to be outside my window at this hour. The breathing continued, then a single high-pitched note from the piano. I don't remember falling asleep. All I remember is waking up the next morning, the sun shining through the trees, and the overwhelming sense that something had been inside my room. From that night on, I refused to go anywhere near that part of the woods again. A few days later, I mentioned the experience to an older ranger, half expecting him to laugh it off. Instead, his face grew pale. "You heard it too." He went on to tell me that I wasn't the first. Other rangers had heard the piano. Some had even seen it. But the truly unlucky ones, the ones who went back a second time, they never came back at all. I left Olympic National Park at the end of my assignment, and I never looked back. But sometimes, late at night, when the world is quiet, I swear I can still hear it. A single distant note, calling me back. Some places were never meant for people. I learned that the hard way when I was stationed at a remote fire lookout tower deep in the forests of Montana. It was an old structure, built decades ago, perched high above the treetops, with nothing but wilderness stretching out in every direction. For 2 months, I was assigned to live there alone, scanning for wildfires and reporting any smoke or strange activity. It was peaceful at first, just me, the wind, and the endless sea of green. But then I saw something in the trees. It started on the 3rd week. I was sitting in the tower, watching the sunset, when I noticed a figure standing at the tree line far below. At first, I thought it was just a hiker. But something about it was wrong. It was too still, too rigid, just standing there, staring up at me. I lifted my binoculars to get a closer look. There were no features, no face, just a dark, human-like figure standing among the trees. I looked away for just a second, my heart pounding. But when I looked back, it was gone. I didn't sleep well that night. The tower was designed for solitude, with nothing but thin wooden walls and large glass windows all around. No real protection, just me, alone, in the middle of nowhere. The next evening, it happened again. This time the figure was closer, still standing perfectly still, just at the edge of the clearing around my tower, watching. I radioed it in, reporting a possible trespasser, but there was no response. The radio had been acting up all day, only catching bits of static and broken transmissions. I told myself it was just my imagination, a trick of the light, a shadow cast by the trees. But then that night I woke up to a sound that made my blood run cold. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, circling the base of my tower. I held my breath, gripping my flashlight like a weapon, listening as the steps moved around and around the structure. Then, the creaking of the first step. Someone was climbing up the tower. I scrambled to the window, shining my light down, but there was nothing there. The footsteps stopped. The night was silent, but I could feel it. Something was out there, watching, waiting. By the time morning came, I convinced myself it had been a dream. Sleep deprivation, paranoia. Spending too much time alone can mess with your head. But when I stepped outside to check the area, there were footprints in the dirt. And they led all the way up to the first step of the tower. For the next few nights, I barely slept. Every evening, as the sun set, I felt it getting closer. The shape in the trees, the footsteps, the sensation of being watched. On the final night, I woke up to breathing. Not mine, not an animal's, something deep, ragged, right outside my window. I turned my head, moving as slowly as I could. And there, pressed against the glass, a face. If you could even call it that. It wasn't human. Not exactly. It was stretched, wrong, featureless, except for two deep black holes where eyes should have been. I didn't scream. I couldn't. My body locked up, my breath frozen in my chest. The thing outside the window just stood there. And then it smiled, a slow, unnatural grin that stretched too wide. I lunged for my radio, blindly calling for help. Static. Nothing. Then, in the silence, knocking. Slow, rhythmic knocking against the glass. I snapped. I grabbed the emergency flare gun from the supply cabinet and fired it through the window. The explosion of red light illuminated the darkness outside. But there was nothing there. Just trees, the wind, the empty forest. By the time backup arrived the next morning, I was already packing my things. I didn't care if they thought I was crazy. I didn't care if I lost my job. I had spent enough time being watched. As I drove away, leaving the tower behind, I made the mistake of looking into my rearview mirror one last time. And there, standing at the tree line, just barely visible in the morning mist, something watched me go, and it was still smiling. Not every ranger makes it out of the woods. I learned that during my final assignment at Black Hollow Preserve, an expanse of untouched wilderness known for its dense forests and deep, winding ravines. My job was simple: spend the summer monitoring the trails, keeping an eye out for hikers, and making sure no one got lost in the backcountry. But people did get lost. Too many, actually. There were stories about Black Hollow, old legends passed down from the rangers who had worked there before me. "The forest doesn't want you here," one of the older guys warned me on my first day. "You'll feel it, sooner or later." I didn't believe him, not at first. But by the third week, I understood. It started with the missing time. I would hike a trail I knew should take only an hour, but when I checked my watch, 3 hours had passed. Or I'd be patrolling near sunset, and within what felt like minutes, the sky would be pitch black. Then came the voices. I'd hear my own name called from deep in the trees. Sometimes it sounded like my radio crackling to life, except it wasn't my radio at all. It was the wind, or the trees, or something else entirely. One night, I was patrolling near the ravine when I spotted a light in the distance. It looked like a flashlight bobbing gently through the trees. I radioed in, thinking a hiker had gotten lost after dark. But no one responded. As I moved closer, the light suddenly split in two. Then 3. Then a dozen. A whole cluster of pale, glowing orbs flickering through the forest, weaving between the trees like fireflies. But they weren't fireflies. They were too big, too bright, too unnatural. Then I saw something worse. A figure standing perfectly still in the shadows just beyond the lights. It was tall, too tall. Its limbs were thin, unnaturally long. I couldn't make out its face, but I could feel it watching me. I took a single step backward, and the lights vanished. The figure didn't move. But somehow I knew it wanted me to come closer. I turned and ran. When I made it back to the station, I slammed the door behind me, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I told myself I had imagined it, that I was overtired, that my mind was playing tricks on me. Then I checked the clock. It was 3 hours later than it should have been. I hadn't just run back, I had lost time. That was the first night I considered quitting. But the final straw came 2 weeks later. It was nearly midnight when my radio crackled to life. "Ranger, help. I'm lost." A woman's voice, weak, static-filled. Down in the ravine. Every instinct told me not to go, but I was a ranger. It was my job to help. I grabbed my flashlight and rifle, making my way toward the ravine as the voice continued, growing weaker with each transmission. But as I neared the edge, I noticed something strange. There were no footprints, no signs that anyone had gone down there at all. And the voice, it wasn't coming from my radio anymore, it was coming from the trees. Help me. Closer now. Please. I swung my light toward the sound, and something was crawling up from the ravine. A figure, pale, wrong, its body twisted at an unnatural angle, limbs bending in ways that should have been impossible. And its face, it was mine. My own face, staring back at me. Grinning. I didn't scream. I couldn't. I ran. I never went back to Black Hollow Preserve after that night. I don't know what I saw. I don't want to know. But I do know this. Not every ranger makes it out of the woods, and some never leave at all. The Silent Screams, the channel of interesting horror stories. If you are new on this channel, then don't forget to subscribe The Silent Screams and press the bell icon for interesting stories. Before we move on, please donate me in the form of subscribe.